Hello, everyone. We are so glad that you are joining us today for this webinar. We are so excited to have Holly Lee here talking to us all about narration. And I know that this can be a subject that's really it can seem really overwhelming. And so I'm really glad that we're going to break it down today and make it really doable, practical, and a great part of your homeschool. I'm so excited about this because this is a part of our whole series, our whole Charlotte Mason series. We have webinars, we have blog posts, we have so many resources all on Charlotte Mason, including a giveaway. Right now, you can enter a giveaway to win a $50 shop credit to the Peaceful Press and a physical copy of Mothering by the Book by Jennifer. Hopefully, I say her last name right, Pepito. And we are just really excited that we are able to offer these resources. And I've shared the link to those in the chat. And so now we're going to go ahead and get started. Holly, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Holly. I've been homeschooling since 2018. I have 3 kids. I have just recently started homeschooling all 3 of them, though, under one roof. My husband and I have been married since 2011, and I call North Carolina my home, born and raised here. I was a public school teacher for 4 years, and I have been called, my husband and I feel like we've been called to homeschool our kids. At least we take it year by year, but we're becoming more and more used to homeschooling. And I particularly love Charlotte Mason and her methods. So I also have a blog, and it's at mylittlebrickschoolhouse.com if you're interested in learning more about our story.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Holly. And I'm excited to see that the comments are already here, and you guys are also so excited. Thank you, Megan, for your comment that your kids protest about narration and their daughter feels like she can't do it and it's too hard. I think that Holly is going to talk about that today, and hopefully you'll get a lot of good ideas. So, when we are talking about narration, what is really the Charlotte Mason principle behind narration? Like, why did you feel this was important, and where does it kind of come from?
Well, Charlotte Mason grew up in the 1800s in Britain. So she was used to seeing the world kind of changing at that time. The world was modernizing, and the education system reflected this in trying to get students to kind of pick a track or some kind of trade to go into. And so the view of the student, the view of education was kind of changing, and she was bucking up against this more modern view of children. The children she saw were born persons. They had a body, a spirit, a mind, and the modern, more or less, modern prevailing attitude was children were more like machines. You know, you input the information and they output, and it was heading towards a more utilitarian way of educating. So Charlotte Mason had to kind of buck up against this way of thinking, and her view that informed her desire to teach children narration was she believed that children don't really own knowledge until they can express it. Every person is created uniquely, and they have the ability to glean different things. So something that a teacher might read aloud to a group of 10 students might be ingested and analyzed and synthesized and expressed differently between each child. So no two children are the same. And so her principle is really like children are going to, if they're really going to own the knowledge that they take in from good books, then they have to be able to express it. And to really define it in the most simplest terms, narration is telling, it's retelling. So, we narrate throughout our day. And if you don't mind, Melissa, I'm going to just share a little bit of my story with narration from a very young age. So I've been familiar with narration since I was learning to talk, as I'm sure all of you were familiarized with narration at a very young age. Hopefully, our parents, we grew up in homes where our parents talked to us, and told us about what we were doing throughout the day. Now we're getting ready for dinner, and now we're going on a walk outside. Oh, look at that beautiful flower. And they were just giving us all these exposures to all these ideas. And as children, hopefully we had that experience. And so from a very young age, you've been narrating, you've been telling about what you've seen. And my earliest memories are actually some of the sweetest. My dad, every night before I went to bed when I was 2, used to read Goodnight Moon to me. And I know Goodnight Moon is one of those classic children's stories. I remember him reading it in the very comforting tone of his voice, and the pictures were very comforting. And eventually I got to the point, I was probably about 1.5 or 2, where I could recite, "In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon." And it goes on and on. And this became so familiar to me. And these stories, although I wasn't necessarily narrating, I was more reciting what I had heard. This story was a foundational piece to building my knowledge of the world. And so from the very beginning, we're giving our kids stories, we're giving our kids nursery rhymes, we're talking to them. And those are the building blocks of narration, and they're the building blocks of composition. Really, narration, it starts with informally telling and just orally composing, but it moves to more formal written composition eventually. And so, you might sit down with your family and your kids are just telling you about this awesome book they just read, or the last chapter they read in the one of the books of the Wing Feather Saga, or maybe you're discussing what you did that day to your husband. Well, you're retelling, you're narrating, you're just retelling in an informal setting. So in the formal setting, it just looks different, only in that the teacher carefully selects the materials that she or he is going to put in front of their students. So you have a wide variety of books that you might select from, but it's the same idea. You're retelling, and the goal of narration is for the child to own the knowledge. In other words, the goal of narration is self-education. Narration is not a performance, although it might feel that way at times. Hopefully not too often, but it might feel like you're asking your child to perform. It's not an evaluative tool. It's more just a way for the child to go through the process of owning what they're taking in and expressing it.
I love that story about your own childhood. It's so beautiful. And I think I can relate to experiences that I see with my own children, because I just think of all the times as I was preparing for this, I started thinking about all the times that my kids have just like read a book and told me, like basically narrated it to me. But I never thought about how that's also narration too. So I think it's such a great point to bring up that this is a skill that we naturally use in some ways. So we can use that skill to a more focused aim and focused purpose to really further our own education and the education of our children. But why does it matter? Why does using that skill matter, and what makes it important?
Well, I think Karen Glass does an excellent job in the book Know and Tell. It's a book about narration. So if you don't have it, if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. She said, I quote, "We want our children to learn, certainly, but we also want them to love to learn, to develop a taste for all kinds of knowledge. Narration is the digestive process of education, and children will tackle it with much more energy and goodwill if the meal itself has been appetizing and satisfying." So she puts it out there like, if you're giving them good books, good stories, then they're going to want to possess that knowledge, and not just one kind of story, but a wide array, a wide variety of stories. Other reasons narration is important is it is a universal tradition. God made us this way, to love stories. It's in us. It's been in use since the ancient times. The Greeks used it. Socrates would question his students at the beginning to open their minds about what they were about to learn and secure their cooperation in the teaching process. And then the ancient Egyptians, if you have ever seen the hieroglyphs, you're kind of thinking maybe this is a form of narration. I mean, it's definitely communication, but those communications on the sides of the tombs tell a story. And then it just points to going back, we are people of the spoken word and the written word. So it's just part of who we are as human beings. And narration, secondly, gives us the ability to own our own learning. I already hinted at that earlier, but self-education is the goal of narration. And this is kind of a fun fact. There was the founder of the American Sunday School movement. His name was H. Clay Trumbull. He believed narration was great for learning God's word and for teaching God's word, having the children narrate back what the Bible story was about. And so it's really like an excellent way to get the child to dig for those nuggets of truth that they're presented with, and in their own way express the truth that's there. Charlotte Mason said, "What a child digs for becomes his own possession." So it's pretty important and integral to becoming a more knowledgeable person to be able to express what you're learning. And then thirdly, narration is great for practicing an essential cognitive skill. Like, it takes higher level thinking to be able to narrate. It's a hard mental work. So that's why, I mean, it would make sense that children sometimes can be reluctant to start because it is hard mental work. It takes comprehension, sequencing, analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating, even like they have to evaluate which points of emphasis are the most important to present in their, or to talk about in their narration. And a good thing about narration is it's one of the ways we teachers can use like questioning without making it so narrow as a fill in the blank or a multiple choice test. Open-ended questions really allow for someone to dig for what they've learned. And so the child, for example, if you ask a question about a book, the child has to dig through the whole book to kind of gather the most important bits and pieces. And so in a way it is an evaluative tool, but that's not the main goal of narration. And then fourth, narration is a great way to connect with others. So like if I'm listening to my son narrate about the Wing Feather Saga, because he just finished book 1 and he's really excited about it. We're going to have a party tomorrow night. We're going to watch it. The first one, and we're going to have cheesy chowder, which is one of the recipes that the people in the Wing Feather Saga had. And so, I mean, there's so much excitement surrounding this book, but just hearing him at the dinner table talk about it and having a lot of good questioning coming from my daughter. Oh, tell me about this character. What did this character do? All of that is just a great way to connect because it shows me what stood out to my son. And it's neat to see like what points of emphasis he held on to. It's special also to be able to read aloud with my kids and to be able to like narrate to them, model it, and they get to see what stood out to me, and they kind of pick up on my thinking. So it's a great way for us to see kind of into each other's minds, and we connect through that shared experience. And it's one of the great joys of homeschooling, I think. So yeah, I just think it's so important.
I know exactly what you mean about that connection aspect. I think when we're able to like talk about a book or like have those discussions and you can like really see, and even if they're not like narrating in the moment, maybe later you see something and all of a sudden like a spontaneous narration comes from them about a book that they read, which you might not even think of as narration, but it's all a part of it. And that's like the really cool thing is that we can use this intentionally as a tool, but we can also notice the ways that it happens naturally and see the way that our kids are growing in that way as well. And so you talked a little bit about how a meal must be satisfying as well as appetizing. So, how do you find the right kind of meal or really book that is going to be both of those things? Because we want to be teaching with quality literature. I think anyone would say that that's a goal of theirs. It's frustrating when you pick up a book and you read it and you're like, this is just not any good. So, how can we really find the resources that are going to be the best fit to have all of these wonderful qualities?
I think that some really great websites exist out there. Um, the Simply Charlotte Mason website is excellent for just suggesting what they call living books. And this is a term that Charlotte Mason coined. She said that children must have books, living books. The best are not too good for them. Anything less than the best is not good enough. So she believed that children actually respond best to well written books, books that use a lot of rich vocabulary, high quality literary language. It's actually, it draws them in, it draws their attention in. Uh, the story, obviously, that's important too. So you have to have all those pieces, but how do you know what that would look like in practical um, scenario? Well, I think that I've always used this criteria because the Simply Charlotte Mason website laid it out really well. And I've always been able to look at a book in the library, kind of open it, read the first page or two, maybe read the last page and get an idea more or less of whether or not this book is a living book. So a living book is usually written by one author who has a passion for the subject that he or she is writing about. Um, so, for example, there's this author named Jim Arnosky. He is all into nature study. I just recently discovered this series that he wrote of picture books called Crinkle Root. And he really gets into like, here are some ways that animals have adapted to their environment, but he doesn't use those words. It's not written in a very like dry way. It's really, it comes alive because the character Crinkle Root will take you on this nature walk, this adventure, and he'll point out all these things on the nature walk, and it's almost like you're there. Really, like you could have gone on a field trip, but this book is probably the next best thing. And so that's one of the first things that comes to mind when I think of that first criterion, which is the written by one author who is passionate about the subject. Jim Arnosky comes to mind there. And then, secondly, it reads like the author is telling you a story in narrative form. And thirdly, it's well written. It doesn't contain a lot of choppy sentences. It's not condescending to children or adults. I mean, it's pretty important. If you're reading a book and it's completely boring to you as the adult, then it's probably not a very good pick for your child. And it uses language richly. Another criteria, it fires the imagination and touches the emotions. So if you can picture it in your mind's eye, then it's probably a good fit. And then it contains ideas and not just dry facts. So ideas like certain virtues. Is it teaching, about somebody's inner strength or about somebody's challenge they had to overcome, some kind of adversity? It points you to somewhat timeless truths that people across the ages have acknowledged as the good life. So those are some things I look at when I open up a book, and I also like to just see, does it look like the author has kind of this dedication to enriching the lives of children. If you know a little bit about the author, that might be a good thing as well, to kind of familiarize yourself with the author and what kind of books the author is known for writing.
Those are some great suggestions, and I love that. Like, any one of those things can be present in like any book, but it's when you can find all of them together that you really know that you're going to have a winner. And like you can tell by your kids' reactions,
Mhm.
whether or not like when they're really into it, when they're like engaged, then that's a pretty good indicator that you've probably found one that's going to be a good fit, because kids, they'll just tell it to you like it is. If they think it's boring, they're going to tell you that they think it's boring. And so
Mhm.
you found some books, you've used your resources, you've found some books. What now? How do you actually get started with narration? We've talked about how like it's something that we do naturally in our lives, but now if you want to pull it in and use it in a more intentional way in your homeschool, how is the best way to get started?
Well, I think just begin. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of prep other than finding some really good books to put in front of your children. Um, I mean, you have to have a mindset though that this is not a performance. This is not probably going to go the way you thought it would the first time around. It's going to look kind of messy. But, you know, the very first thing you can do, even in the formal school setting, is to just read to your children. And I know before they become formal school aged, you are probably already reading to them and talking to them and engaging them in conversation. Um, but, you know, when they're ready to formally narrate, you might want to think about what kinds of texts you want to introduce at the younger ages, like ages 6, 7, 8, like through third grade students. You might want to consider um, pulling out some really good nursery rhymes for the younger ones, fairy tales, fables. Those are Bible stories. There are some really good children's story Bibles out there. There's one in particular I'm thinking of. I think it's called A Child's Story Bible by Catherine Voss. Don't quote me on that, but that one is a really good one for like elementary age students. And I would also consider the length of what you're presenting them. So if you're reading like a fairy tale, um, you know, you might want to start with an abridged version instead of the full thing. And Aesop's fables are actually really great because the length is fairly short. So you know the little kids, the attention span is not going to be as long as somebody who's like 10. So just start, you know, small and start with paragraphs. Maybe after like a paragraph, ask the child, turn to the child and say, so, you know, what stood out to you there? Or what was this about? Um, but it should be fairly informal, even though you're doing it in school. There shouldn't be like this air or atmosphere of pressure. uh, you know, start with the oral. So around the time they're 6, you can ask them to orally narrate, and they can even draw it. I mean, it doesn't have to be oral all the time. There are many different modalities to narration, but starting first with that spoken word, they're not quite ready to write you a paragraph on it. That comes later when their hand muscles are more developed, but those are the main things. Like, make sure you're starting small, you give them the right kinds of books, and that they love their books and they're not, you know, completely over their head, or, you know, they're not too boring. I mean, school, sometimes things take a little work, right? It's not always going to be fun, but it can be enjoyable. And so just giving them something to like be kind of engaged and excited about is probably a good way to start narration.
Yeah, I love the suggestion about drawing, because I find that, you know, sometimes if my kids are feeling like I ask them to narrate and it's feeling like too much for them, I say, okay, draw a picture. And then after the picture, I say, what did you draw in this picture? And then that's when they start narrating with the words. So, like, if they can't get it out on the words, you know, have them draw that picture. And then in drawing that picture, that will give them like their own reference that they can use to tell you about what they remembered and learned.
Yeah,
So
I think that's great. I like that idea.
yeah. And what if the narration is lacking? What if you have tried all this? You've tried to just start, you've started small, you've tried with pictures, and it just still seems to be falling kind of flat. What can you do then?
Well, I mean, there could be many reasons why the narration's lacking, and Karen Glass does a great job once again in Know and Tell. She breaks down, you know, even a chapter on special needs. But those people who find writing and reading difficult often benefit from the oral work of narration. And so it could even be that the student listens to an audiobook. Uh, there's another student that reads to the one who's struggling, or the teacher can read aloud. But there are ways around that. Like everybody has something they can contribute, whether it be really, really, limited or a whole lot. But you have people you know, all over the spectrum. And so, something though that I think a lot of us might struggle with when you find a narration kind of falling flat, or somebody is saying, "Well, I don't know," or um, I forget," or something. Before you even begin the narration, I think it's a good idea for the teacher to kind of have an idea of which dates, if it's a historical text or if it's a science text, which terms they want to highlight ahead of time. And what you can do is write them down, each date on an index card, and or each term on an index card, just a few. Don't pick out a whole lot. That could be overwhelming, but just a few key dates or events and terms, and pre-teach it ahead of time. So you can say, like, we're about to read this story on the French and Indian War. Here are some key dates, and kind of preview it with your students first. And I want you guys to be listening for these dates because they're going to be important. And I would love to hear them when you tell me what we just read. I would love to hear you pull these dates out. I mean, you could even make it something kind of like a game. Like, if you can pull out these dates, I'll be keeping track of what you're including in your narration. And I don't know, you can do some kind of incentive for that. I don't know. I have not incentivized my narrations before. I don't really know if that's a great idea, but that is an idea for motivation. Kids are very motivated by little, stickers or treats. And I know that's not a Charlotte Mason thing at all, but I'm just saying sometimes you have to do what works for you. So you might want to consider, though, if you have, and I think that the text itself is something that should be engaging enough that the child is like intrinsically motivated to tell you what he's learned. But if you're stuck on narration and if you feel kind of frustrated, then have you prepared ahead of time? Have you written the key events up on the board or on the index cards? Have you modeled narration? It's good to model first, especially when you're starting out. You could do half of the narration and they do the second half, You read a paragraph and you start the narration and your child finishes it for you. Have you tried narration long enough? Sometimes it's just like we try something 2 or 3 times and we say, "Oh, this isn't working," and then we give up. Well, have you been, trying it long enough, and has it had a chance to kind of gain momentum? Have you tried other ways to narrate? I have a narration resource right here I made that has alternative methods to narration. You could write, a one-act play from a scene, for example, or you could draw a map of the place you just read about. I mean, that takes a lot of mental processing, but it's the same thing as synthesizing the information and then expressing it in a new way. Is the book feeding the imagination enough? I'm a fan of Karen Andriola. She wrote A Charlotte Mason Companion, and she has a great example of a time she was asking her daughter to narrate from, I think it's the Laura Ingalls Wilder book, On the Banks of Plum Creek. And it just wasn't like going anywhere. Like her daughter was kind of like, first of all, reluctant to read the book with her and not really getting into it. And her narrations were kind of lacking. And so upon reevaluation, Karen Andriola just decided to switch and try Farmer Boy instead. And that really grasped, or I should say, gripped her daughter's imagination. And she could tell a difference in their narrations as well. So sometimes it's just a matter of, is the book the right kind of book? And so, like you were saying, Melissa, some kids will parrot word for word what you just read, and that's not really a narration. And so to encourage them to make their own retelling of what they just read, have them retell it in another medium like draw or make a Lego creation if they're really into Legos. I know my son is, and then tell you about it. And that is kind of a way to discreetly get them to retell in their own words. So those are just some suggestions.
I think those are really great suggestions. And as you were talking, I was thinking if you are starting with narration, an easy way to model that is I can't speak for every family, but in our family, we do a lot of read alouds. And I don't often do narration with these read alouds. We do them in different areas, like with our history, we do narration. But a way that you could start to model narration is, say, if you're reading a longer chapter book, you're probably not going to read the whole thing in one sitting. So then at the beginning, before you read the next chapter, you can narrate the events that have happened so far before you got to that chapter. And that is a way you're starting to like model that narration for your kids when you're recapping what you've done up to that point in the book, so they can remember. And then you are showing them like an example of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's great to be able to recap first. Um, it's sometimes easy to forget that, but I need it for myself, to be honest. I need to go back and say, what did we learn about last time? And so that's a great thing to do, because if I need help doing it, then they might need help as well. So
Also, I also want to add that I did just put in the comments a link to the narration matrix that you just mentioned. So if people want to find that, they can go to that link there and find it. And while I'm saying that, I think it's a good moment to take a brief break. I want to thank one of our sponsors. We have several sponsors for this series, for the Charlotte Mason series, that are helping us make it possible to do these webinars and the giveaways and all of the parts of the series. And so today I want to take a moment to shout out to Daily Skill Building. Daily Skill Building offers award-winning open and go homeschool resources that make homeschooling easier. Oftentimes homeschool curriculum can be dull and boring or way too teacher intensive. Some kids freeze up with worksheets and have trouble comprehending text. This in turn can cause stress and tears for both kids and parents. It's time to ditch the busy work and lay aside the textbooks. Let us show you how to make homeschooling easier. Again, that's Daily Skill Building, and you can go and check them out, as well as the other sponsors on our website. I'll link to that again in a moment. And so let's dive back into narration. So say you have got this, you started narration, and now your kids are older. How does it look as kids age? How do you progress through the years with narration, making it so that it is skill appropriate and age appropriate for kids at different levels?
well, we touched a little bit about the early years, birth to kindergarten, making it spontaneous, informal, more like what we are doing. We're modeling language and all of that. As they progress into school ages, so from grades 1 to 3, the goal is to build that oral fluency. And then after about, I'd say, age 9, so grades 4 to 6, um, you're working on building writing fluency. Their muscles have developed, and you're not going to start right away with, like, here's something I want you to retell in writing. You're not necessarily going to start like that, but you might seg in with like a model. You're showing them how you narrate in written form. And you know your narrations are obviously going to be a little different from your 9-year-olds, but you're just modeling that from the get-go. And so I would say you're continuing your oral narration. You never drop that. But the writing fluency and the stamina is really going to be something you're focusing on for grades 4 through 6. And then when you get to 7th grade, up through like 9th grade, you're developing those composition skills. So more like adding description and dialogue, and just working on having a really good narrative arc, or a beginning, middle, and end. Or if you're writing informationally, you're focusing on supporting your main statement with facts and details. So, you're working on that, but you're still writing your narrations. You're having them read and respond. And usually that would take place over the course of the day. You would expect for kids in the upper grades to be able to write and or speak a total of 3 narrations. That's what I've been told, at least from the books that I've read and some of the conferences I've attended. I don't think every one of those narrations has to be written. I think that as long as you're doing like 3 a day, I think you're covering a lot of bases. Um, but then by grades 10 through 12, you're working on uh, refining your composition skills and learning more formal writing, like the research papers and that kind of thing. But giving them that foundation of composition through oral narration first, that is just so that's such a I could say privilege, I guess, because they've had so much practice with it. So by the time they're in the upper grades, they're just able to like speak about what they're learning. They're just constantly like analyzing and expressing what they've been reading, and it's just such a habit by that point. Now, I'm not the expert on that because I don't have kids that are that old. My oldest is 9, but check with me in 10 years and I might be able to speak more to that. But I think that generally speaking, from what I've read and learned, the grades 1 through 3, you're going to aim for maybe 1 narration a day, and that's oral. 4 through 6, 2, sometimes 3. And some of those could be written, some of those could be oral. And then, like I said earlier, the upper grades, you're aiming for about 3. You can vary the subjects you narrate. Um, for example, like my son, he's in 4th grade, and 2 days out of the week, I have him read a living science book. I've already selected the science books and I have them in a basket by the fireplace. He chooses which science book he wants to look at and he reads it for about 20 minutes and then he responds. And I have a notebook, it's just a composition book with a chart that I've created. And each day that he is reading his science, he will respond in some form. It's either going to be by writing like a written narration to what he's read. That's one of the things. The second thing is he could ask 4 questions about what he's reading. And sometimes this takes teacher's guidance, like to kind of model like what a good question would be like. But I mean, it is a great way for the child to engage with what they're reading. And then the third thing is 4 facts, right? 4 facts. And that's kind of like narration because you're picking out some really like big ideas from what you're reading. And then the fourth is a wild card day. So he can choose, he can create something. I give him a few options: create something in drawing, or he could make something out of Legos, and he could draw a diagram or make a comic just to show like he understood what he was reading. So that's how I kind of sneak in narration throughout the week, besides our like history. When I'm reading our history spine, I'll usually stop after a page and ask, so what did we just read about? And that's another kind of quote unquote sneaky way to get the narration in there, or the oral narration. And then we have a book of centuries, and Charlotte Mason, a lot of teachers that love Charlotte Mason use book of centuries, where children, when they're reading, or if we're reading something together, we will find like an event, like a historical event, and then find the page of the century. So each page has like a two like a, what do you call it, a spread, a two-sided spread of a century. So like 1601 to 1700. And then what events have we come across? Oh, this happened in 1625. So let's go to our book of centuries, open it up to that spread, and draw or write a quick sentence or narration about the event and write the date next to it. That's another way to incorporate narration, kind of in a covert way. But it really all depends on what you're reading and what you want to accomplish. You can really just think about the different things you're teaching and how you can work in narration into what you're already teaching. It could be your child is doing a writing program and they might already have narration worked into that writing program. Well, it's great. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just kind of evaluate what you're already doing. And I think that's a great way to work in narration.
I think one thing that's been really helpful to me in my homeschooling life is to remember that any tool that we use in homeschooling is not all or nothing. So if you
Mhm.
are feeling like you cannot do narration for all subjects, but it is something that you want to incorporate in your homeschool, even just adding it for one subject will be beneficial. So I just want. I always say that because I always need the reminder for myself because I have a very all in personality. And like when I get excited about something, the next day I want to do it in everything. But that really
Yeah.
quickly leads to burnout. So if you are just starting with narration, remember that some is beneficial and it doesn't have to be everywhere and all the time to be beneficial. That even just starting with a small bit is really beneficial. And so, speaking of getting started, can you just paint a picture for us of what it looks like when you're doing narration? What's the teacher doing? What's the student doing? How does this like work? If like we've heard all about it and how to get started, but like for those of us who need really concrete examples, can you just tell us what that looks like?
Okay. So it might look like this, for example, if I'm with my first grader, we read Aesop's fable, one fable. Let's say we read The Fox and the Stork. We just read that yesterday. And after a couple pages, I'll pause and I'll look to my daughter and I'll say, "Can you tell me what this is about so far?" I might also, if it's our first time narrating, or if we haven't narrated in a long time, I might begin the narration. So far we've learned about the fox and how he's a trickster and he really wants to trick his friend the stork. So he makes this elaborate dinner and anyway. And so I'll keep going like that and pause. And then I'll ask her to add on. Can you add on to that? And then we'll continue reading. But just like, your look on your face matters, but I know it's hard to maintain that like expectant look. But if you could just kind of take a step back and just try to put yourself in your kids' shoes, they don't want a lot of questioning. Like when they're narrating, your job is to just sit there and listen and then, hopefully smile. I know that's really hard to do sometimes, but just think of how you would want to be received if you were putting all this mental work into this task. It sounds simple on the outside, but it is a lot of mental work. And so um, it might be hard to do that every time, but if you alternate the modalities, like say you're asking your first grader after they read some of The Fox and the Stork, you're asking them to orally narrate. Well, then later, after you read some of your history, you might ask them to draw a picture. So then you're not, you know, having to maintain that expectant look on your face the whole time, but, respond and do not interrupt. So if they're doing an oral narration, your job, like I said, just sitting there, you're not interrupting. Um, you're not even correcting them. Even if there's something that they say that's incorrect, just listen. If they get stuck and they need they need you to give them a little bit more, you might add to their narration, or you might ask the question in a different way. Like, if you could tell me the most important things from this story, what would you say they are? Um, if you get blank stares or I forget, I don't know, I don't like that kind of thing, just, once again, check. First of all, are you guys on good terms? You might need to just take a break and come back to it later. Second of all, just, making sure the book's appropriate. Can they comprehend it? Did you recap the previous day's narration or the previous day's reading? Were they attentive while you were reading? Are you having them like sit there for like 20 minutes and listen? We probably shouldn't be doing that with elementary schoolers. If you have a history lesson, the history lesson can include both the narration and the reading, and that should take no longer than 20 minutes altogether. Make sure you're requesting their narration right after you pause. You don't want to like say, "Oh yeah, we're going to narrate this," and like you do another subject, and then you come back to them and say, "Can you tell me about what we read an hour ago?" You're doing it right then and there, and then just be patient with them. I mean, it's it's such a teacher thing, I think, to want to ask more like discussion based questions when a child's narrating, or to stop them and like add to it, or like point them in a different direction or something, to interrupt them like that. It might be tempting to do that, but really our questions should be more open ended. And um, if you're promoting engagement from the get go, and you're giving them like some key words to look for, um, I think those are good places to start. And then really don't, the problems you might encounter might be fewer if you're kind of looking at a standpoint. And also to keep in mind that narration builds over time. It's not going to be something that's going to sound perfect. It's not a presentation, but it's the process that you're really leaning into. And so, the expectation that we're focusing on, like remembering what we're reading, that's really what we're focusing on. And it's okay to have them narrate twice. Um, Karen Glass talked about this when she spoke to us at the Simply Charlotte Mason retreat. You can ask a child to narrate twice because you're focusing on the importance of remembering. Now, you wouldn't necessarily read the whole text to them again and ask them to narrate, but it might be a good idea to have them narrate from the same text more than once so they can build on what they've already been able to express. Build the length of the narrations as their attention span increases. So you're starting out with paragraphs, then maybe pages, and then maybe when they're older, chapters. So it's an incremental thing, and it's really a process as opposed to a product.
Yeah, I think those are all really great. I think two other things that I've noticed in my own experience is one of my kids is a little more shy about doing narration in front of his siblings. And so then sometimes just being able to be one on one with them and doing that narration can be easier for some kids. Or sometimes we go on a walk while we do our narration, and being in like side by side, it feels less pressure than sitting down does. And so if you have a kid that's feeling pressured by narration, you can try and find ways to ease them and put them in a setting where they feel more comfortable and able to do it.
That's great. I love that. It reminds me of like some kids do a lot better when they're moving around, like jumping on a trampoline or bouncing on a ball or something. Like narration could fit into that context as well. So
Yes, for sure. And
great.
so, I know you mentioned earlier that you are part of a Charlotte Mason co-op. How would you do something like this in a co-op setting with a larger group, in case anyone out there is in a Charlotte Mason co-op or wants to start a Charlotte Mason co-op? How can that be done in a larger group setting?
So our co-op, I think the oldest child is 12, I want to say. She's almost a teenager. And the youngest one is probably 3 or 2. So we have a lot of little kids. But I think that by the time they're in the upper grades and writing, used to doing their narrations in written format, then you would have like your reading as a group, and then you would send the older kids away to write their narrations. And then you're just with the younger kids. And if you have a lot of younger kids, it might be a good way to keep everybody engaged to have like you start and maybe give like just one sentence to narrate. Maybe even recap first and then start model, and then have the children just one at a time add to your narration. and that way everybody is engaged. Hopefully, like if you go down the line, you could do it that way. Or if that's intimidating to some kids, then you might just call on kids to add to it, like who can add to the narration. And it's good to have those younger ones face to face though. So um, it's something we've also done in our co-op is we've gotten broken up into groups. And the mom who did the reading, she read Blueberries for Sal, and she had us get into groups with a different mom in charge of each group. And what we moms were doing, we were just guiding our little group of like 4 or 5 kids through a narration. And so it's as simple as that. Like you can just break up into smaller groups. That might give everybody a chance to share. Those more reluctant narrators might be more willing to retell if they see that you're like expectant and excited about what we're doing and what we're reading.
And in a setting like that, or even in your own home with your own kids, should you have this expectation that every narration should be the same?
No, I mean, everyone is obviously different and they're going to glean different things from what they're reading. Now, I mean, there might be some key things that you want to highlight ahead of time to kind of, prepare them for what you're emphasizing, but it's really their narration. And the goal, once again, is self education. So they're the ones putting together the pieces. And if you have to correct, I will say if there's an incorrect date or something, don't stop them in the middle of the narration. But at the end, it might be a good thing to correct them on the date. But, give them maybe some positive feedback first and then correct them. Or if they have something completely out of order, give them some positive feedback and then correct them at the end. But the goal, once again, is self education.
Yeah, I think it's so important. That's kind of the beauty of the narration, right? Is that it is asking each child what they remember and to put it in their own words. And so, of course, they wouldn't be the same, but it might feel like it's really important when you're doing narration not to compare the kids to each other,
Mhm.
because they're working through it through their own mind, shifting through everything they remember, everything, all of their past life experiences. Sometimes what I find in narration is that sometimes other stuff will pop out that they remember, that they connect it to, which I know Charlotte Mason also talked about connections and everything like that. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because that's like another topic for a different day, but it's their own brain, and everyone's brain is different, and all the things that are in our brains are different, so that, and of course our narrations would be different. So if everyone is different, how can we tell when we have done a successful narration, when our child has done a successful narration?
I think it's pretty simple. Just if they are able to tell you something about what they read, compose their thoughts either orally or in writing, that's success. And if you're doing it faithfully, I really do think like you will see the fruit of it later on. I've heard from people who are a lot more seasoned than myself, they've graduated multiple kids from high school. They just their perspective is important to me, and I've heard them say, look, they were prepared above and beyond for college. And yes, there are certain formats of formal writing that you're expected to do in college, but it was just a matter of learning the format, learning that form, that they had been used to this habit of just retelling, and starting it from a young age in oral form first and then building on the written form. And it's like it becomes habit to the point where maybe you can't help yourself, when you're older. I like to mark up my books. I was not really trained in narration when I was a child. I went to a public school, and yes, I mean, I'm sure we did a lot of retelling, but it wasn't a common practice to narrate for the sake of knowledge and self education. That simply wasn't what we were asked to do. It was more like reading comprehension questions and fill in the blanks and multiple choice. And those are exercises and they exercise the mind, but they aren't necessarily going to feed the mind. So, narration, it feeds the mind if you're taking in and expressing out. I mean, it's all part of this process of learning and interacting with the world. So I really feel like if children are doing it from a young age, the fruit will come later. And even during the younger years, you see that fruit. And I really think that that's the key. Like if they've been able to learn from what they're reading, that's as simple as that. You're successful.
That is such a great point about how the things we do with our children when they're little, we can't always see the fruits right away. But when we just keep working at them with time, we definitely see the fruits. There are so many more things about narration that we could talk about, but we are fast approaching the hour mark. So I want to invite anyone watching out there, if you have any last minute questions you want to ask about narration, now is a great time to ask them. Holly, if there is one thing that you want people to take away about narration after watching this webinar, what's the one thing that you think is most valuable to remember about narration or to put into practice about narration?
I think narration is done best when it's done faithfully. It's imperfect, but it is done. And that's the main takeaway.
I love it because we sometimes we can work things up in our head to be really big, and it can just become this whole big thing. So Holly, if people want to connect with you further and with your other resources, do you want to tell them a little bit about where they can find you and some of the different resources you offer?
Sure, you can find me over at mylittlebrittschoolhouse.com. I have my narration matrix free for download on my website there. I also have curated a list of living books for different times of the year, certain holidays, and um, I have, having been in classical conversations in years past, I have a list of books for each of the cycles every week. So if you want to check out those things, I do have a lot of book lists up on my website. I also have that science notebook uh, template that I was telling you about that we use with my son. That's also one of the links that I will share with you all. But as for me personally, my goal in just doing what I'm doing is to help provide people with resources, living books, and some Charlotte Mason resources, classical education resources. And I'm currently writing a book on the life of G.K. Chesterton. It's a living biography, and I cannot wait to share that with everybody who wants to read it. I think we're in process right now, but the publisher is keeping me informed, and hopefully we'll have an announcement sometime soon.
Writing a book is such a big process, so I commend you on that because I know there's so much work and effort that goes into that behind the scenes, and I can't wait to see it when it's finished. I linked both to your narration matrix in the comments and also to the science notebook template. Thank you so much for sharing those with us and for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom on expertise. I do want to also remind everyone before you go that the Charlotte Mason mini collection is going to go on sale on Monday, and it is going to have some awesome resources. I'm going to link the page again where you can check out the coming soon details as well as the giveaway, which if you weren't with us at the top of the hour this week, you can enter to win a $50 shop credit to the Peaceful Press and Jennifer Pepito's book, Mothering by the Book. And you can also check out our future webinars. We'll be having a webinar next week, same day, same time, I believe. I set it up. I should know this, right? With Emily of A Delectable Education, talking about handicrafts. And so I hope that you will join us for this series and that you'll check out the mini collection when it goes on sale on Monday. Thank you again so much, Holly, for joining us. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And I hope that everyone has a chance to check out all the resources we mentioned during this conversation and that you are able to incorporate narration into your homeschool in a way that's beneficial for you and your children. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.